I was attracted to Jane initially because she's so damn funny. Jane Austen is hilarious, and a lot of men in particular don't know that because they think of her as chick lit, they think of her as, a romance novelist. And certainly she writes marriage stories. She is writing in the early part of the 19th century, and she's writing about women in rural England, and their lives are marriage stories. That's what they are. But she's hilarious. She is a satirist of the very first water, and that's what drew me to her. And one of the things I found when I did read my reviews is that some of the reviewers remarked that they thought my ending was too rushed. And I don't think it's too rushed, but I suspect it's because they wanted more romance.
This time on the Plutopia podcast, we explore the world of fan fiction. Author Stephanie Vale joins John and Scoop to discuss her new book, The Colonel's Brother, a work of Jane Austen fan fiction. Stephanie guides us through the popular Jane Austen fan fiction genre and describes her journey from reader to author.
Hey everybody, welcome to the latest episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. Our guest today is Stephanie Vale. Stephanie is a semi-retired attorney, part-time university instructor in the Northwest, and she's someone who's loved Jane Austen for more than 40 years, 4 decades, and has been reading Austenesque fiction since 2008. There's this whole fan fiction thing around Jane Austen, which is part of what we're going to be talking about today. In 2017, she finally got inspiration and started writing it herself. And she has a first book out called The Colonel's Brother, which is, I guess, would you say it's a variation on Pride and Prejudice?
Yeah, it's a Pride and Prejudice variation. That's the technical term for it.
Wow, that's a handful there to absorb Pride and Prejudice and then kind of morph it into something new. It sounds, this kind of reminds me of alternate history. It's like you've done an alternate history version of Pride and Prejudice. Is that a fair way to present it?
That's actually a really interesting way of thinking about it, and I think that's probably right. But this is the very essence of the genre called Austenesque or JAFF, Jane Austen Fan Fiction. We take one of the books that we love, although I would say the vast majority of Jane Austen fan fiction is devoted to Pride and Prejudice, and we pick a moment, a pivot point in the story where it's interesting to ask the what if question. And then having asked the what if question, we spin that out into an alternate narrative. And according to canon, not just Jane in canon, but Jane Austen fan fiction in canon, you pretty much have to write one of these so that Darcy and Elizabeth end up together, because otherwise you'll have a full-fledged revolt among your readership. But I personally don't really have a strong interest in writing stories where they don't end up together, so it hasn't been a challenge for me.
Has anybody ever rebelled and written one where they didn't end up together?
I'm sure that's happened, and I've probably read it, but I don't remember.
I could imagine one where Elizabeth shoots Darcy.
Yes, and actually, I have read one where she shoots Wickham, which is pretty.
That's easier to imagine.
There's a great moment where she shoots him, and he's just rolling around on the ground. She shoots him in the leg. He taunts her when she pulls out the gun. He says, you don't know how to shoot that, and he starts advancing on her, and she just squeezes the trigger and fires at him and hits him in the leg, and he's rolling around on the ground screaming imprecations at her and calling her names, and it's pretty entertaining.
So is it fair to say that a lot of what's being written as fan fiction for Jane Austen is focusing on Pride and Prejudice?
Yes, the vast majority of it. There's some really fine fan fiction that isn't devoted to Pride and Prejudice. There's a book called Jane Fairfax, which is one of the first books of Jane Austen fan fiction I ever read, which is Jane Fairfax is one of the secondary characters in Emma. And Jane Fairfax is a really interesting character and a little bit mysterious. We don't know a lot about her. And this book, which is by a novelist named Joan Aiken, the daughter of Conrad Aiken, is basically Jane's backstory. And it's extremely well written and very, very entertaining, and spins out a whole set of interesting explanations for some of the things that happen in the book that we all know. And that's just a fantastic book. And there are others that are, there's one I'm reading right now, which is called The Year in Between, which is a variation on Sense and Sensibility. But yeah, the vast majority of them are spin-offs of Pride and Prejudice.
I have a number of friends who are really into fan fiction of various sorts, Star Wars and Star Trek. And from what they tell me, it's vicious when someone disagrees with your approach to a treasured character or a treasured plot. Do you encounter that sort of thing in your fan fiction?
As a rule, I would say no. And I'm going to indulge in a bit of generalization here. I think a lot of it is because we're mostly women. The fandoms of Star Trek and Star Wars are not mostly women. There are a lot of women in them, but the fandom of Jane Austen is not entirely female, but largely female. And people do get vicious in the online reviews, but they don't stalk each other. They don't bait each other into conflict. They just express poignant dissatisfaction in the online reviews. And I mean, I've done something in my story that there's a violent episode that a lot of people don't like. And I put a content warning on Amazon for it, but some of the readers, and I knew there would be people who would hate it. And there are people who hate it. And there are people who are writing complaining reviews on Amazon saying the content warning didn't go far enough or whatever, or, it was a terrible plot device and I shouldn't have used it, and all these other things. And, one of my friends who is a very experienced JAFF author said to me when I first did this, you have to learn not to read your reviews. You just have to learn not to read reviews. And I'm not there yet, but I certainly don't look at them more than once every couple of weeks now. And it's only been 2 months since I published, but I've gotten to the point where I don't look at them more than once every 10 days to 2 weeks. And I just basically check to see if I'm still over 4 stars on Amazon. And if I am, I take a deep breath and I glance at the reviews and I say, that way lies madness, and I close the browser window.
Yes, I know it could drive you crazy, couldn't it? Well, I found myself wondering how you developed such a passionate interest in Jane Austen, and how did that lead you to JAFF?
Well, first of all, you have to keep in mind that Jane Austen died very young. She was only 41 when she died, and she only completed 6 novels before she died. And even the last 2 were published posthumously by her brother. And it's unclear that they were in the final form she would have published them in. So she's not like Dickens or Trollope or a lot of other authors that people love. It's very, very easy, entirely too easy, to be a Jane Austen completist. And so you read the 6 books and they're all wonderful in different ways. And then you hit the wall and you can reread them, and I do. But if you are an Austen craving beast, as I became, these books are comfort food. The other thing that was going on for me in about 2008 was there was there was this big global economic downturn, and the company I was working for was not immune to those issues. And we actually had a huge layoff in the spring of 2009, which I survived, but it was a stressful time. And these books are comfort food. And Amazon, God bless them, showed me a link to this trilogy of books that the trilogy is titled Fitzwilliam Darcy, Gentleman. And the trilogy is a retelling of the whole story of Pride and Prejudice, but with Darcy as the viewpoint character instead of Elizabeth. And I thought, well, this sounds interesting, because one of the things about Austen is that she made a rule for herself. She would never write a scene that was between two men alone, or more than two men alone. She felt she didn't know authentically how men spoke to each other when there were no women around. So she never wrote a scene like that because she didn't feel she knew how. So Darcy is a bit of a cipher to us through a lot of the book. He's an interesting guy, and he develops that he's a total mensch, but we don't find that out till pretty late because we only see him from Elizabeth's viewpoint. And so I picked up this trilogy and started reading. And first of all, it was extremely well researched, and the language felt authentic. All the situations felt authentic, and it was extremely well written, and it was just fantastic. And I read it and it was like, wow, this is like discovering a whole new book of Jane's, 3 whole new books of Jane's, actually. But, it was a story that I already knew, but I was being privileged to view it from a different perspective. And that was my gateway drug into JAFF. And once I discovered that, gave it a 5-star rating on Amazon. Amazon was gracious enough to lead me down the path and show me other titles that I might be interested in. And that was how I started reading JAFF. And I pretty quickly figured out that some of it was really, really good, and some of it really wasn't. There are books that use vocabulary that is too modern, and that'll pull me right out of the story. There are books that are poorly edited, because most of this stuff is Kindle Direct, and including mine. So you write it, you edit it, you put it online. And when I find a lot of typos, those will often take me out of a story. I don't punish those people usually with bad reviews. I just don't leave reviews. But the good stuff is really good. And I figured out who some of my favorite writers were in the genre, and I just follow them on Amazon. And I've become friends with a lot of them on Facebook. We have this whole Facebook community of JAFF readers and writers, and we have monthly Zooms, and we read from works in progress and all of that. It's a very accepting, welcoming community, and it's a community that I'm really thrilled to be a part of.
I like what you said about not leaving the bad reviews. I'm from that same school of thought. In a previous lifetime, I was a music journalist, and I was always asked to do reviews, and I hated it, reading reviews. So I just, I declined it. I declined a bunch of money because they wanted to actually pay me for that. But I just found the whole idea of reviewing just a bit, pretentious. It's like my opinion is better than someone else out in Kansas or wherever. But, one thing I wanted to ask, John said you were okay with mentioning that you are using a pen name, as am I. Obviously, no one would name their child Scoop Sweeney. I wasn't named after my favorite ice cream or something.
I have a friend whose son is nicknamed Scoop, but that's not his real name.
So what motivated you to go with a pen name rather than your birth name?
Well, first of all, I'm 65 years old, and I have had a career. I am relatively well known in my field by my real name. And I'm not at all ashamed or embarrassed. I mean, if I were ashamed or embarrassed about writing JAFF, I wouldn't be talking to you guys. I wouldn't be posting about it on Facebook under my own name or anything like that. But I view JAFF as lovable fluff. And I am actually working on something else that I'm saving my real name for, which is not JAFF, and which is somewhat more literary, mildly speculative fiction that takes place in the near future. And I've been working on that for years. And in the last few months, I've actually, well, in the last 5 years, I workshopped it several times. I workshopped it twice in the last few months. And both of the instructors told me that they thought that it was potentially pretty commercial, something that I could actually get an agent for and sell it to a commercial publisher. And I feel as if it's not necessarily a wrong thing to save my real name for that and continue publishing JAFF under the pen name. Also, my real name is long and complicated. When people hear it, they never know how to spell it. And Stephanie Vale fits nicely on a book cover.
Does this new work you're working on involve baseball?
It does not.
Oh,
At least not so far. I mean, there may be an outing to a baseball game, but it doesn't really involve baseball.
wow.
I do love baseball, as you can see from looking behind me.
I know. I was looking at all the baseballs, and I kind of knew that already since we know each other.
It's true. It's true.
I'm just wondering, what's the market like for this fan fiction? Are people doing it mostly for fun, or are there people who are making real money from writing this sort of thing?
Well, I asked long before I thought about publishing, I asked a friend of mine who is an established author in the genre if people made a living doing it. And she said, no, not really, but it is, she's a professional editor and technical writer. And she said, it's for her, she has maybe 10 titles in the Amazon store. And for her, it's a nice second or third flow of income, but it's not a living wage, as it were. I will say that it's been interesting for me. So I've had my book out since the 3rd of August, and it has sold fewer than 300 units, which is to say combined ebooks and paperback copies, majority ebooks. But 80% of my royalties are coming from Kindle Unlimited page reads. So, and I think that's pretty common for genre fiction generally. Genre fiction is the kind of ecosystem where there are a huge number of titles coming out all the time, and the readers just plow through them one after another because they know that's the genre they like to read. And I think it's true of detective stories. I think it's true of romance. I think it's true of science fiction, a lot of it. And so I put my book into Kindle Unlimited, and Amazon collects $9.99 a month from all of these readers, and then they parcel it out according to how many total pages each of us has read from our works during each month. And right now, I'm closing in on 350,000 total pages read, which I realize that that's not a Stephen King kind of a number, but it sounds like a very satisfying number to me. Now, does that translate into a lot of money? No, it doesn't. I would have to basically publish a new book every 6 months for several years to build the kind of backlist that would generate a really meaningful ongoing stream of income, I think. And I don't have the time to do that. I don't right now have the creative impulse to do that. And I didn't write this book because I thought I would get rich from it or even make a lot of money from it. I wrote it because I needed to write it because it was a story in my head that wouldn't go away. And I needed to push myself and see whether I could not only write it, but I paid a professional editor to edit it. I paid a professional book jacket artist to create my book cover from a vintage painting that I had found. And all of that it was a test for me to say, do I have the kind of commitment to this process that will cause me to see it through? And there's my book. And so I did it partly as a test of myself to say, okay, am I up to this? And turned out I was, which I'm glad to have found out. And I'm pretty pleased with the reception that it's getting. And I am working on a couple more JAFFs in addition to the bigger book that I mentioned. And yeah, I'm going to be teaching for the next 10 weeks. So, and then grading final exams. So I probably won't do much serious writing again before January, but I plan to keep chipping away at all of them and see what happens.
I was reading your section you did with John and other people on the Well, writing about your work, and you mentioned that you're wired differently than most Jane Austen fan fiction people. Can you explain how you're wired differently, or how they're wired differently?
I shouldn't presume to assess such a large population of people, but I do have the impression from the things they say on Facebook and the things they say in online reviews that they are much more comfortable with the tropes of romance than I am. I was attracted to Jane initially because she's so damn funny. Jane Austen is hilarious, and a lot of men in particular don't know that, because they think of her as chick lit, they think of her as, a romance novelist. And certainly she writes marriage stories. She is writing in the early part of the 19th century, and she's writing about women in rural England, and their lives are marriage stories. That's what they are. But she's hilarious. She is a satirist of the very first water. And that's what drew me to her. And one of the things I found when I did read my reviews is that some of the reviewers remarked that they thought my ending was too rushed. And I don't think it's too rushed, but I suspect it's because they wanted more romance. And once I had gotten to the point of serving up the happy ending that the canon requires, I didn't really feel like writing a lot about courtship and romance. That didn't appeal to me as a writer. I didn't feel like describing it. I didn't feel like putting in 30 or 40 or 50 pages of it. I just thought, okay, spoiler alert, there's going to be a wedding. Okay. And once the commitment to have the wedding is reached, there are a couple things that have to happen. And then, there's a wedding. And I didn't dwell on, you don't actually see the wedding. I don't describe it in any detail. I say a couple of things about the actual wedding day. The weather is nice and so forth, but I don't personally have a lot of patience for the tropes of romance. I'm not judging people who do. I personally don't. And I'm not here to tell you I've never read a romance novel. I have. They're fun to read, some of them. And I actually, I just bought a couple of Stacey Abrams romance novels because I hear they're really good and I'm determined to read them. But it's not a genre that, absent Jane, I would ever have gotten into. And so what I do is, the story that I tell here, and the other stories that I'm working on, are character-driven stories that I hope are at least a little bit amusing in large part, and true to the characters that Jane created as filtered through me.
You mentioned romance. How about sex? Is there much sex in Jane Austen, and is there much sex in the fan fiction?
There is no sex in Jane Austen.
I didn't think so.
No. Jane almost certainly was a virgin when she died at age 41. She was engaged to be married for about 12 hours and backed out of it. The guy she was engaged to be married to was named Harris Big Wither, which is one of the great names. It's like something out of Woodhouse, Harris Big Wither. And she was very good friends with his sisters, and he was rich. She would have had a comfortable financial existence if she had been married to him. But there was no birth control in those days. She would have been vulnerable to, all of the ills that came with childbirth in those days. She would have had servants, obviously, because in those days, almost everyone either had servants or was one. But she would not have had the freedom to write that she had as a single woman, even though she spent most of her life pretty poor. And so there's no sex in her books. There is sex in some JAFF, and it's very controversial. My friend Abigail Reynolds has written a series of books in which Darcy and Elizabeth anticipate their vows. This is what we call it, and engage in actual, P and the V sex before they're married. And it is, of course, a terrible potential scandal, and it's extremely controversial in the community. There are readers who just don't want to read it at all. And Abigail's a great writer, and her stories are good. I don't personally care whether there's sex in my JAFF. If it's a good story, I'm fine with it. If it's not well written, I'm not going to want to read that. But there's also a whole category that I would classify as basically Regency porn, which is, very, very explicit stories where the couplings are the whole point of the book. And most of that isn't very good. I've probably read 5 or 6 of them, and I'm sure there are a lot more. I don't consider those to be mostly all that good. There are a couple of sexually explicit ones that I recommended in the online discussion. One of them is called Pride, Prejudice, and Pleasure. And one of them has a really long title, and I'm going to get it wrong, I think. But the title is Mistress. And the subtitle is something like being a Pride and Prejudice story not suitable for those who have not reached their majority. And that's actually, they're both very entertaining books in addition to all of the coupling that takes place in them. But, I think Jane would probably be a little bit shocked, if more than a little bit shocked, if she knew about them. But she would, I think, appreciate the compliment that is being paid to her and to her characters.
You mentioned that some of your reviews criticized you for being rushed in your ending. And it's funny, I've, over the years, been criticized by various radio and print editors that I needed to stop talking, 2 minutes earlier. I need to stop writing 300 words earlier. And I found that to be actually good advice. But, why do you think people were offended by your ending?
I think they wanted more. I think they just wanted more romance than I was able to give them. I think they wanted more, and it's hard for me to really even on a cellular level, it's really hard for me to understand what they wanted because of the way I'm wired. And so I believe that what they wanted was more courtship and, more, sort of between the proposal and the wedding, more, fun times together, romance type stuff. And even the way I just described it to you must signify to you that I would be terrible at writing it. And so, all I can do as a writer is make the choices that seem authentic to me, that seem right to me, and put it out there with the full knowledge that there are going to be people who are going to approach it from a perspective that's going to make them think this isn't good or this isn't what I wanted. And this is why my friend told me not to read reviews. And this is why I try not to, although, as I said, I'm not quite there.
One of the things that I really love about the Jane Austen stuff I've been exposed to is the language of it, which is, to some people, it's kind of convoluted, but I just, it's so poetic, actually, in a sense, and so powerful. So how hard is that? How hard it is for you to get the language down?
Well, it's very hard. As a modern person, I don't speak that way. I don't write that way. I don't put yous in words like honor and favor, but for purposes of publishing this book, I did. And one of the things that I had to basically, so I've read obviously all of Jane's books many times, and I've read a fair amount of JAFF, and I've read enough JAFF that when there's a jarring word, they will take me out of the story. And so I feel as if I came to this enterprise with a reasonable ear for what it should sound like. But from time to time, I'll have a word that I want to use, and the word will just feel wrong. And one of the examples I gave in the discussion on the well was the word deadline. So one of the plot elements of this book is that the Colonel's brother, Henry Fitzwilliam, has been told by his father that he's over 30 and he needs to settle down. He's knocked up too many housemaids and he needs to settle down and find a wife. And if he doesn't do it by a certain date, his father is an earl. The earl is going to suspend his allowance. And Henry has some expensive habits and can't afford to not get his allowance. So he's pretty actively looking for a wife. And you and I would call what his father just did, giving him a deadline. But the word deadline, so my best friend is Google Ngram Viewer. So whenever I'm pondering whether a word would be an authentic word for that era or any era really, I go to Google Ngram Viewer and I look for it. And the word deadline just wasn't in use during the Regency period. Just, it came into use later in the 19th century. There it is. Google Ngram Viewer. And so, so what I did was, I looked for it and I thought, okay, well, I can't use deadline. So I started thinking about alternatives. I went to thesaurus.com and looked at all the different, and, nothing was perfect. So I finally decided, well, let's check out ultimatum. And I looked at ultimatum in the Ngram Viewer and it had a little more activity. And I thought, okay, I'm going to use the word ultimatum and I'm going to tweak the language so that ultimatum makes sense in the context and do that. But that's the kind of exercise that if you're going to do this, you have to go through whenever there's a word or a phrase that just feels too modern for what you're trying to get at. And one of the other examples I think I mentioned was there's a scene where Charlotte, who is Elizabeth's best friend, she's married to a parson who is a ridiculous human being. And
is that Collins?
Yeah, Mr. Collins.
Yeah.
He does something extraordinarily ridiculous, even for him. And Charlotte sees him do it. And when I originally wrote it, I said something like she stuffed her fist in her mouth to keep from laughing. And that was just way too modern in tone. And so I think I changed it to Charlotte covered her mouth to keep from laughing, which felt more appropriate for the period. But things like that. I mean, I'm a modern person. I think in modern ways. I'm steeped in Austen and Austenesque, so I have a decent ear, but I have to constantly police myself to make sure I don't commit that kind of anachronism.
There's one thing I really have to ask. It's something I kind of don't completely get about the Regency period, I guess, but it seems like everybody in these novels is just kind of sitting around. Nobody has a job. There are obviously some people doing work somewhere, but you don't see them. And then you have all these people with these allowances, and they just live off their allowances, and they just kind of do whatever the hell they want to. Was it really like that?
Well, yeah, sort of. So here's
Is that totally an upper class thing?
It was, so Regency England was pretty rigidly defined by class. If you were a gentleman, you owned an estate and you were supported by the rents paid by your tenant farmers. So, in the case of Darcy owned a huge estate in Derbyshire called Pemberley. And Pemberley was enormous and he had a huge number of tenants who farmed the land and paid him rent. And he was rich because, and Austen tells us this, Pemberley returned £10,000 a year. So anyway, Darcy lives on this huge estate called Pemberley that returns £10,000 a year from his tenant farmers. And Darcy is a gentleman. He does not work for a living. And socially, people who didn't work for a living were, at a certain level of society. He was not titled. His uncle was an earl. His grandfather had been an earl, but Darcy himself is not titled. So the peerage, or just below the royal family, and then below the peerage are the wealthy landowners. And then you have the people who were in trade. And that's everybody who owned a store, everybody who was in the import-export business, everybody who owned a restaurant or a pub or a bar or whatever. Those people were in trade, and socially they were very much below the gentry, the landed gentry. And then below them you have the people who are in service, and those are the people who actually washed the clothes and cooked the meals and dusted the rooms and all of that other stuff. And those are the people at the absolute bottom of the social totem pole. So it's a real thing that if you owned an estate, you didn't work for a living. You lived on the work of other people and the rents they paid you. And Bingley, the character that Elizabeth's sister falls in love with in the course of the book, Bingley is the son of a wealthy tradesman. His father owned some kind of a factory in the north of England. And Bingley his father left him an enormous pot of money in the hopes that his son would become a gentleman. So he sent him to Cambridge or Oxford to get a gentleman's education. And then he left him all this money so that he could buy an estate and become a gentleman. And that was his father's big dream for him. And that's so the fact that Darcy is willing to be friends with Bingley, even though Bingley doesn't own an estate yet, is intended as a marker of the fact that Darcy isn't quite as much of a snob as people might think.
But Bingley's definitely a more laid back character, right?
Yeah, he's temperamentally, above and beyond his social class, temperamentally, he's like a puppy. He loves everyone. He wants everyone to love him. He's easy to please. He's very social. He loves to dance. He's very jovial and he doesn't like conflict. He wants everyone to have a good time and get along. He's a lovely human being. He's not necessarily someone that he's not necessarily the most serious person in the world, but he's a lovely human being. And it is obvious that he and Jane Bennet will have a happy marriage.
So I wonder, where did the Bennetts fall in the class thing? Because they seem to kind of be sitting around too. It doesn't seem like the elder Bennet is out doing anything. What's his gig?
So they are landowners, but they're smaller landowners. They have Longbourn is the name of their estate, and it returns somewhere between £2,000 and £3,000 a year. And they have 5 daughters. So the angle with Longbourn is that Longbourn has an entailment on the title. And what that means is that Mr. Bennet doesn't actually own it. He has a life estate in Longbourn. He has the right to live there and collect the rents and act as if he owns it for his whole life. But when he dies, because he doesn't have a son, his children are not eligible to inherit. The estate is entailed to his cousin, Mr. Collins, the parson that Charlotte marries. So Mr.
The
Collins,
wacky guy.
Yeah, he's one of Jane's greatest characters. He's so ridiculous. And he comes to visit and fully intending to marry one of his cousins, because he's heard that they're all good looking. And he wants Jane because Jane is the most beautiful, but Mrs. Bennet puts him off Jane because she thinks Bingley is going to propose to Jane. So he turns his attentions to Elizabeth, who thinks he is utterly ridiculous and no one she would ever consider. And it dawns on her slowly and with existential dread what his intentions are. And she can't even process the fact that he thinks he should marry her. And when he proposes to her, Mr. Collins' proposal to Elizabeth is really, really funny and a masterpiece of character exposition. Because even though we already know that Mr. Collins is ridiculous, we find out so much more about how ridiculous he is in the course of his proposal to Elizabeth. And anyway, she turns him down. She has to tell him several times, no. And he says, well, you're just trying to increase my suspense. I understand that this is something that, that females do. And she said, no, you have to understand, I'm not trying to increase your suspense. I'm turning you down. And he doesn't understand how she could possibly turn him down, because he's going to be the owner of her home. When her father dies, this house, she doesn't have the right to live in it anymore if she doesn't marry him, So, but she turns him down, and of course her mother is distraught and outraged. And Mr. Collins goes to have dinner with the Lucases, who live next door. And Charlotte, meanwhile, is 28 years old. She's an old maid, and she's pretty desperate to get out of her parents' house. And she doesn't find it all that difficult to manipulate Mr. Collins into proposing to her. And they get married, and they go off to the county of Kent. Longbourn is in Hertfordshire. They go off to Kent, where her husband is the parson, the rector to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who happens to be Darcy's aunt. And that's where Elizabeth goes to visit her later in the book. But the Longbourn returns about £2,000 a year, £2,000 to £3,000 a year in rents, which isn't bad at all. It's not in Darcy's league, but it's not bad at all. The difference is that they have 5 daughters. And so, Darcy and his sister are the only 2 residents of Pemberley besides all the staff. But Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 daughters, so they are supporting 7 people plus their staff on 2,000, 3,000 pounds a year. So their lifestyle is considerably more modest, but he is a gentleman and has all of the social capital that goes with being a gentleman. That's probably more than you wanted to know.
Well, I'm a big fan of British TV comedy, particularly the period pieces like their adaptation of P.G. Wodehouse' Jeeves and Wooster, which paints the British aristocracy in a somewhat less favorable light than some of their other period pieces. But did you ever have a temptation to go to those extremes in your fiction?
Well, there are people who are pretty ridiculous in Austen, and I enjoy caricaturing them. But most of the people that Austen wrote about don't deserve, in my mind, don't really deserve that kind of treatment. And as long as I'm writing in her universe, I haven't felt a need or a desire to go there. But Mr. Collins, I have some fun with Mr. Collins in this book, and Mr. Collins richly deserves whatever abuse he gets from everywhere, because he's just a silly, stupid, shallow, ridiculous man, and not a credit to the Church of England at all. And Jane, in her own, in her own books, Jane went pretty hard on the clergy, considering that she is the daughter of a clergyman. And she has a couple of pretty ridiculous clergymen in her books. Mr. Elton in Emma is, just a classic. He's like the Joel Osteen of Regency fiction. And Mr. Collins is ridiculous in a bigger, broader, more slapsticky kind of way than Mr. Elton. But it's always been mildly amusing to me that Jane, the daughter of a clergyman, went after the clergy so hard.
I wonder about Wickham. Wickham's kind of an interesting cad of a character. You get the impression that he's done something really horrible, but then when you hear Darcy's sort of description about what it was Wickham did, it doesn't seem like completely horrible, but he does seem to be
to elope with a 15-year-old
kind
girl.
of a bad guy.
To elope with a 15-year-old
well, yeah, that
girl.
was kind of bad. That's
terrible.
Bad.
I mean, it's pretty bad, especially one as sheltered, and part of it is that she was very sheltered and innocent. But Wickham is a bad. I mean, you could say he's just a charming rogue, but he's clearly, I think the word is a hebophile, somebody who is very attracted to girls who are sort of just past pubescent. And he tries to run off with Georgiana Darcy, partly because of her money and partly because it's the best way he can think of to get revenge against her brother. But then he takes up with Lydia Bennet. And I think in the case of Lydia Bennet, it's because she was willing. Not to put too fine a point on it. Lydia Bennet was up for an adventure.
Ready, willing, and able.
Ready, willing, and able. And, somebody once asked me, why do you think Wickham ran away with Lydia? And I said, because she was willing to go. I mean, I think to him, she was a convenient piece of ass to accompany him on. He was about to desert his unit because he owed too much money in gambling debts to his fellow soldiers, and he couldn't pay them. So he was about to desert. And, and the penalty for desertion in wartime was death. So to desert even a domestic militia unit was a very serious thing. But he had reached the point where he felt that was what he needed to do. And So he's in Brighton with his unit, and Lydia is there on a lark with her friend who's married to the colonel, different colonel. And she, she's hanging out with Wickham, and the text suggests that they had gotten as far as third base and maybe a little further, unclear. And she finds out, I'm not sure he tells her because she's terribly indiscreet. She could never keep a secret. She finds out that it's his plan to leave, and she decides she's going to go with him. And he is not the kind of guy who, out of strength of character, is going to tell a besotted 16-year-old girl that she can't go with him on this adventure. And so she becomes a convenient piece of ass. And I really believe that if it were not for Darcy's intervention, he would have abandoned her in London or sold
That was going to be my
into-
next question. I mean, that seems to be implied, and that's certainly what everybody was worried about. But
Yeah.
I found myself wondering whether he would have married her eventually anyway.
No,
He didn't really
couldn't
have the
afford to
means,
marry
did
anyone.
he?
He couldn't afford to marry anyone. And I think he would have sold her into a brothel if he could have. He could have picked up a nice piece of change for that. But he would, at a minimum, he would have abandoned her, and she would have been ruined. And that would have ruined, in those days, it would have ruined her whole family. All of her sisters would have been ruined because she was ruined. And no respectable man would have been willing to marry any of them. Now, there's an argument to be made that Bingley, because he didn't have social, he didn't value his social standing as much as other people thought he should, might have been willing to marry Jane anyway because he still loved her, but his sisters probably would have talked him out of it, especially Caroline, because she was a bitch. And I think Lydia would have been ruined, and Bennetts would have been ruined, and Darcy knew that, and that's why he had to rescue her, not only because he hoped one day to marry Elizabeth, but because he didn't want Elizabeth to suffer, and he had the means and the knowledge to figure out how to prevent that from happening.
So he was a good guy, but he was a little bit self-interested too.
Yeah. There's no question that in the back of his mind was, I can't marry her if her sister is ruined, but I have the power to prevent that from happening.
Has anybody in the JAFF world speculated on the future of Wickham and Lydia, and how that might have been? Because I wondered a lot about that. Like, how is that marriage going to work, and was he actually going to hang in there?
Oh, yes. This is so great. So just this past summer, there was a one-man show, a one-man stage play produced in Britain, in England, called Being Mr. Wickham. And it was co-written by a writer named Catherine Curzon and Adrian Lucas, who is famous for having played Mr. Wickham in the 1995 BBC A&E miniseries adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And together they constructed a one-man show that takes place on Wickham's 60th birthday, in which he, you can hear Lydia in the background occasionally shouting at him to come to bed or whatever. And he's sitting up in his study, and he is, just reminiscing about the last 40, 30 years of his life. And it is absolutely magnificent, really, really wonderful. And I maybe it's because I'm older now too, but I actually find Adrian Lucas much more roguishly appealing at this age than I found him in the original miniseries. There was something kind of greasy and slick about him when I watched that miniseries that I couldn't find appealing at all. But watching this, I don't have any doubt how it is that women could have been attracted to him. And it's just a magnificent show. And he reminisces about his relationships with obviously with Darcy, who's now family to him, is sort of his brother-in-law, and the rest of the Bennet family, and his marriage to Lydia. They are still married. And, I think it's entirely possible that in Jane's world, the marriage between Wickham and Lydia would not have turned out quite so well. But it's a fun thing to imagine.
I'm wondering about, this is shifting gears a bit, your writing process, because I was just remembering you used the term pantsing in the well discussion that we were having. Could you talk a little bit about how you write and what you mean when you say pantsing?
So I don't pants all the time, but when I wrote this, I pantsed because I didn't have to worry about story structure because I had Jane's scaffolding to build on. And that makes a huge difference just in terms of the ability to sit and just write a story and see where the story takes you. When I started writing The Colonel's Brother, I started from an idea and I didn't really know where it went. The story, I won't say it wrote itself, but the story took me where it wanted to go.
And pantsing means flying by the seat of your pants, right?
Pantsing means basically writing by the seat of your pants. So I pantsed The Colonel's Brother, but the big one I've been talking about, the one that's a little more literary and commercial, that one I have really been one of the things that has taken me this long is my challenges with structure. Because one of the things I've figured out is that I'm good at writing scenes. I can write a scene, I can write snappy dialogue, I can write a scene that tells a story in terms of what's happening in that moment. My weakness as a writer, my biggest weakness, I'm sure I have many, is in the scaffolding, the structural material that holds scenes together, what pulls you forward through a story. So one of the things I did this year is I took a workshop from the organization called Save the Cat. And Save the Cat is a pretty famous organization because they're big on their emphasis is on screenwriting, but they have a system that will guide you through writing any kind of fictional story and probably some kinds of creative nonfiction, although you have a little less flexibility there. So what the Save the Cat theory is that most good stories have the same 15, they call them beats, which are plot, pivot points, tent poles that hold the story up, and that in order propel the reader and the writer from beginning to end in a story arc that people will find satisfying. And after thinking about the weaknesses that I have uncovered in my own writing style and my technique and just things that I don't know how to do, I decided to sign up for a Save the Cat workshop, not a video webinar, but an actual interactive online workshop that had only 7 students in it and an instructor. And that was very, very helpful because I had read the book Save the Cat Writes a Novel, and I had sort of internalized some of how that would work. But to actually have a teacher who was very experienced in the technique sort of walk us through and then have us pitch our beats to him, each of us in turn, and have him grill us and ask questions and so forth was incredibly helpful. And so I probably will pants some future JAFF, but I don't think I'll ever pants a real novel, a real original novel, because I don't have the chops to do that. And I envy people who do, but that's not something that I think I'm able to do. I need an outline. I need a structure to hang my scenes on. And having acknowledged that, I figured I'm going to go figure out what I have to do to get that. And I feel like I have it now.
So, and you've been working for quite a while on that other book. And was Save the Cat something that was kind of pivotal and giving you some forward momentum in working on that book?
I think so. It certainly gave me hope in a way that I hadn't had real hope for a while. Because when I first started working on the other book, I wrote a few scenes and I was really, really loving them and thinking, this is great, this is great. And then I started trying to figure out what the hell it was as a thing, like it's one thing to say I have this scene and I have this scene and I have this scene, but trying to figure out what the whole story was and what the plot was that these various scenes fit into as a cohesive thing. That was really hard. And I never gave up on it, but I kind of put it aside and thought, I need to attack this in a different way. I need to figure out how to attack this in a different way. And finally, the Save the Cat workshop, I think, really gave me tools that I didn't have before to figure out how to get after the structural challenge. And as part of the workshop, I built out my 15 beats. So I now need to fill in scenes and connective material that takes us through them. But I feel as if the 30,000 words or so that I've written aren't going to be wasted because I now have a place to put them and an understanding of how they go together.
Yeah, I was always impressed by the extent to which some people actually rewrite things. And of course, I've always found that, like, if I may write a feature or something like that, and I often find myself taking what I wrote at the beginning and moving it to the end, that sort of thing. So I think it's all just like clay, and you just got to mold it, right?
Well, yeah, and you have to also know which parts of it to pick off and get rid of.
Which is hard. Killing your babies. Yeah.
Kill your darlings, as I
Kill
say.
your darlings.
I've already killed a number of my darlings in that particular manuscript, and it has broken my heart every time, but I can't, because I have a tendency to write a sentence and just admire it and say, man, that was great. And I have to break myself of that because nobody cares.
So we're really close to the end of our hour now. I guess the only other thing that I would ask is, have you thought about writing a book with zombies in it? Since Pride and Prejudice and zombies seems to be a thing.
Well, it was a thing. There is also Sense and Sensibility in Sea Monsters. And I confess that although I bought a copy of it, I never read it. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is a great book. If you haven't read it, it's hilarious and it's just really, really good. And I even enjoyed the movie. And Seth Grahame-Smith, who wrote it, came and read at Powell's a few years ago when the book first came out. And I just shook his hand afterwards and said, I don't know if anyone else has said this to you, but I think Jane would really approve of what you've done because it's so well done. It's hilarious. And I would estimate that Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is about 60% Jane and about 40% zombies in terms of structure and content. It's a great book. But having read it, I think it's the platonic ideal of Jane Austen zombie books, and I don't know that I could ever approach it.
Maybe vampires.
No, I can't get it. I don't get into that. I don't get into, vampires. I don't get into werewolves. I don't get into, the zombie thing. If it hadn't been for Jane, I probably would have never touched it. I'm just not drawn to those stories. But anyone who hasn't read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, if you love Jane, you should read it because it's great.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for joining us today. This has been a great discussion.
I'm thrilled that anyone is interested, to be honest. I would not have thought that my thing would be particularly interesting to anyone who wasn't already part of the Austenesque community.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lubkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.